The rain had been falling since 4 in the morning, and Isabella Monroe knew it the moment her alarm went off because the sound of water hitting the fire escape outside her window had already dragged her halfway out of sleep. She lay still for a few seconds, staring at the water, stains on her apartment ceiling before, sitting up and reminding herself that the rent was due in 9 days, and that was reason enough to get moving. She was 25 years old, and she had been waitressing at the Blue Anchor Diner for 3 years. The diner sat on the corner of Madison and Halsted, sandwiched between a dry cleaner and a shoe repair shop, and it smelled permanently of bacon grease and fresh coffee. It was not glamorous work. The tips were inconsistent, the early morning shifts were exhausting, and her feet ached every single evening when she finally unlocked the door to her small apartment in Pilsen. But the Blue Anchor was reliable. The owner, Mr. Gerald, never shorted her paycheck, and on good mornings the regulars were warm and easy to talk to. That particular Tuesday in October was not shaping up to be a good morning. Her umbrella had broken on the walk to the bus stop, turning inside out in a gust of wind and leaving her to walk the last 4 blocks in the rain. With her jacket pulled uselessly over her head, by the time she pushed through the back door of the diner at 6:15, her shoes were soaked through and her ponytail was dripping onto the collar of her uniform. Clara, who had the same shift, handed her a wad of paper towels without saying a word, and that small act of silent kindness was the first decent thing about the day. The breakfast rush started at 7 and ran hard until 9. Isabella moved through it on autopilot, taking orders, refilling coffee, delivering plates of eggs and toast, and keeping her smile steady even when Table 4 sent back their pancakes twice for no reason that made any sense. She had learned a long time ago that waitressing required a particular kind of patience that was different from the patience you needed in the rest of life. It was quieter and more disciplined. You had to absorb the noise and the complaints and the indifference of strangers and turn it all into something neutral so that the next table felt welcomed. It was close to 8:30 when the front door opened and a man walked in. Alone, Isabella noticed him immediately. Not because he was unusually tall or strikingly handsome, though he was both of those things, but because of the way he carried himself. He walked through the crowded diner as though the noise and the clatter were simply background music written specifically for him. He wore a dark charcoal overcoat over a white dress shirt, no tie, and he was scanning the room with calm, dark eyes the color of strong coffee. He was not looking around anxiously the way most people did when they walked into an unfamiliar place. He was simply looking, quietly and without urgency. As though he had all the time available to him that the world could offer, he sat down at a table near the window, the small 2-seater that nobody ever wanted because it had a wobbly leg. Isabella picked up her notepad and walked over. "Good morning," she said. "What can I get started for you?" He looked up at her, and she noticed that he had a faint scar along his left jaw, just visible under the edge of his morning stubble. "Just coffee for now," he said. "Black." She nodded and went to get it. The trouble happened on her way back. The diner was crowded, and someone from table 6 pushed their chair out without looking behind them, catching the back of Isabella's knee. She stumbled forward, managed to stay upright, but the coffee pot tipped badly. In her hand, and a long splash of hot black coffee arced through the air and landed directly across the front of the man's white shirt. There was a half-second of silence at the table. Isabella set the coffee pot down with a thud, grabbed the nearest clean cloth from her apron, and started apologizing before she had fully processed what had happened. "I am so sorry," she said, pressing the cloth toward the stain. "That was completely my fault. I am so sorry. Please let me help. I can get you something from the back. We might have a spare." The man caught her wrist gently before she could dab further at his shirt. Not forcefully, just firmly, and the touch made her freeze. "It is fine," he said, and he sounded like he meant it. There was no irritation in his voice, and no performance of calm either. He was simply calm. "That is not a fine shirt," Isabella said, because she could see that clearly. The fabric was the kind of white that did not come from a department store rack. "No," he agreed, looking down at it. It is not. He paused. But you did not do it on purpose. She stood there holding the cloth, feeling heat rush into her face. I've been doing this job for 3 years, and I've never spilled on a customer. Today was your day, then, he said, and the corner of his mouth moved in a way that was not quite a smile, but was close to one. She got him a fresh cup of coffee, comped his breakfast over Mr. Gerald's mild protests, and spent the rest of the morning shift alternately mortified and distracted. Clara told her to stop thinking about it and focus on table 7. Isabella tried, at 10 o'clock. When the rush had thinned, and Isabella was wiping down counters, the man was still sitting at his table near the window. He had ordered eggs at some point, eaten them neatly, and was now looking out at the rain-soaked street with a paper and a second cup of coffee. When she walked past to clear a neighboring table, he spoke without turning his head. You mentioned you have been here 3 years, he said. She stopped. That is right. Do you like it? It was not the question she expected. Most people asked if she was in school or what she really wanted to do, which was their polite way of suggesting that waitressing was not a destination. This man was asking if she liked it, which was different. Most mornings, yes, she said honestly. Some mornings less. He turned and looked at her. Which kind is today? It was improving until I ruined your shirt. He smiled then, a full and genuine smile that rearranged his entire face. My name is Thomas Harrington, he said. He did not say it the way people said their name when they expected a reaction. He just said it simply, the way anyone might introduce themselves over spilled coffee at a neighborhood diner. She knew the name. Everyone in Chicago who read the business section or walked past a construction site knew that name. The Harrington Capital Group was responsible for half the new development on the north side. 3 mixed-use towers downtown, and the recently announced River Commons project that had been all over the local news for months. She kept her face steady. Isabella Monroe, she said. Isabella, he repeated, as though he was considering the weight of the name. I want to offer you something, and before you say no, I want you to hear me out. She tilted her head. All right. I have a project starting next month. A residential development for working families on the south side. I have been through 4 design consultants in 2 months, and every single one of them has given me the same proposal dressed in different fonts. He paused. This morning, while I was sitting here, I watched you redesign the traffic flow of this entire dining room 3 times in your head to keep from running into people. Isabella blinked. How could you possibly know that? Because you adjusted your route for different ways in 40 minutes, and each time the pattern was more efficient than the last. Picked up his coffee. I need someone who thinks that way. Someone who sees space as something that serves people rather than impresses them. She stood very still, aware that the morning had taken a turn she had not prepared for, and that, somewhere underneath the shock, was something that felt, very quietly, like the first note of something new beginning. I am a waitress, she said. Today you are, said Thomas Harrington. What are you tomorrow? Isabella did not sleep well that night. She lay on her side in the dark with the business card Thomas had left on the table sitting on her nightstand, and she stared at it the way she might stare at something she had found on the street, and could not decide whether to keep or throw away. It was a simple card, heavy cream stock with dark lettering. Just his name and a phone number and the words Harrington Capital Group printed beneath. No title, no list of accomplishments. She had looked up enough about him online that evening to know the title would have taken up the entire card Clara had called at 9. And Isabella had told her everything, start to finish, including the spilled coffee and the observation about the traffic flow and the offer that still did not feel entirely real when she said it out loud. Clara had been quiet for a moment and then said, in the flat and practical voice she used when she was being serious, that Isabella had exactly 2 choices. She could call the number and find out what was real about it, or she could spend the next 30 years wondering. Clara was good at reducing things to their essential truth. Isabella called the number at 8 the next morning, a woman answered, professional and pleasant, and told Isabella that Mr. Harrington had already scheduled a time for her, as though her calling had been expected all along. Thursday at 10. The address was on Wacker Drive. She wrote it down on the back of a grocery receipt and read it back twice to make sure she had it right. Thursday came with clear skies and cold air, and Isabella stood outside the Harrington Capital Group, its building for a full 2 minutes before walking in. The lobby was tall and quiet, with marble floors that reflected the light from above and a reception. Desk staffed by 2 people who both looked as though they had been specifically designed for that purpose. She told them her name and watched one of them pick up a phone and murmur into it. And then she was given a visitor badge and directed to the elevators with a smile that was warm but left no room for further conversation. The 22nd floor opened into an open-plan office that felt more like a well-funded architectural studio than a corporate headquarters. There were large drafting tables along one wall, scale models on shelving that ran floor to ceiling, and floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the river and the gray downtown skyline beyond it. People moved through the space with the focused energy of people who believed in the work they were doing, and Isabella felt the gap between that world and her own, with a sharpness that she tried not to let show on her face. Thomas was waiting near the conference room. He was dressed more casually than he had been at the diner. Dark trousers and a navy shirt with the sleeves pushed up to his forearms, and he looked genuinely glad to see her, which somehow made everything more disorienting rather than less. "You came," he said. "You expected me not to." "I hoped you would," he said, and he gestured toward the conference room. "Come on. I want to show you something before we talk." The table inside was covered with maps, aerial photographs, preliminary site plans for a 15-acre parcel on the south side near Bronzeville. Thomas walked her through it without any of the performative energy she had expected from a man of his position. He did not sell her on the project. He simply showed it to her, piece by piece, and explained what he had been trying to do, and where every previous consultant had failed him. The vision was genuine, and Isabella could see that clearly. He wanted to build 200 units of housing that did not look or feel like affordable housing. He wanted gardens and communal spaces and natural light and streets that were designed for walking rather than just parking. He wanted the people who lived there to feel that they had been thought about specifically, not warehoused efficiently. Every time she asked a question, he answered it directly, and when he did not know the answer, he said so without embarrassment. She was leaning over the site plan, pointing at the eastern boundary when the conference room door opened and a man walked in without knocking. He was in his mid-40s, trim and expensive-looking, with the kind of face that defaulted to skepticism without any particular effort. He looked at Isabella and then at Thomas, and the pause between those two looks carried a full paragraph of opinion in it. "Richard," Thomas said, his voice even, "this is Isabella Monroe." "Isabella?" "Richard Owens, my business partner." Richard extended his hand and shook hers once, briefly. "Thomas mentioned you," he said. He did not clarify in what context or with what tone. "Good things, I hope," Isabella said. Richard smiled in the way that people smile when they have decided not to say what they are actually thinking. He pulled out a chair, sat down, and opened the folder he had brought without being invited to stay. "I had some questions about the Southside project," he said, directing this at Thomas, as though Isabella had not spoken. "Specifically about the design budget allocation, and whether we are still committed to bringing in an established firm for the residential units." "We are exploring options," Thomas said. "We discussed this," Richard said. "The board needs to see credible experience behind a project of this size. We cannot go into the next investor presentation with an untested consultant and expect the numbers to hold." The word untested sat in the room for a moment. Isabella watched Thomas. She wanted to see what he would do with it. He held Richard's gaze without expression and then said, calmly and without raising his voice, that all decisions about the project team would go through him and that he would schedule time with Richard separately to discuss the board presentation. It was not a confrontation. It was a wall, politely constructed, and Richard stood on the outside of it. Richard left 10 minutes later, with the folder under his arm and a tight, professional smile that did not reach his eyes. Thomas closed the door and turned back to the table. "I apologize for that. You do not need to," Isabella said. "He is not wrong." Thomas looked at her. "What do you mean?" I mean that, from a pure business standpoint, he is raising the obvious question. She straightened up from the site plan. I am 25 years old. I have never led a project of any kind. The largest space I have ever redesigned is a diner dining room, and I did it in my head while carrying coffee. If I were sitting where he is sitting, I would ask the same question. Thomas was quiet for a moment. And yet you are still here, because I think I can do it, Isabella said. And I want the chance to prove that to you properly, not just because of a conversation over breakfast. So, before we go any further, I need to know something. Ask, is this offer based on what you actually believe about my ability? Or is it based on an instinct you had one morning and have not fully examined yet? The question landed quietly in the room. Thomas did not deflect it or soften it or answer too quickly, which told her more than any immediate answer would have. He walked to the window and stood looking out at the river for a moment. And when he turned back, his expression was honest in a way that she had not fully expected. Both, he said. And I think you deserve to know that. She appreciated the honesty more than she could easily say. Then here's what I propose, Isabella said. Give me 2 weeks. I will develop a preliminary concept for the residential units on my own time, outside of any formal agreement. No contract, no obligation on either side. At the end of 2 weeks, you look at what I have produced, and you make a decision based on the work alone. Not on the morning in the diner. Not on instinct. Just the work. Thomas looked at her for a long moment. And if the work is not what I need, then you hire the established firm, and I go back to the Blue Anchor, and we both move on with our lives. And if it is, Isabella picked up her bag from the chair. Then you tell Richard Owens that untested does not mean unqualified. She had her hand on the door when he spoke again. Isabella, she stopped. You asked me whether the offer was based on ability or instinct, he said. Can I ask you something equally direct? She turned. Go ahead, why did you actually come today? Not the practical reason. The real one. She thought about Claire's voice on the phone. She thought about the water stains on her apartment ceiling, the 9 days until rent, and the 3 years of quiet patience. She had poured into a job she was good at, but had never truly been meant for. She thought about the site plan on the table behind him, and the 200 families who did not yet know that somewhere in the city, a man was trying to think about them carefully, because she said, some mornings you walk into work and something happens that reminds you what you were originally built for. She opened the door. Thursday was one of those mornings. She rode the elevator down alone and walked out into the cold October air, feeling something she had not felt in a long time. The particular electricity of a decision that cannot be undone, and the strange, quiet courage of someone who has just placed everything they have on a table and meant every single word of it the 2 weeks Isabella had asked. 4 became the most intensely focused 14 days of her life. She worked her morning shifts at the Blue Anchor and spent every hour after that at the small kitchen table in her Pilsen apartment surrounded by graph paper, reference books she had borrowed from the Chicago Public Library, and printed photographs of the Bronzeville site that Thomas had emailed to her without commentary the morning after their meeting. She did not go out. She turned down 2 of Claire's invitations to dinner and ignored the television entirely. She ate cereal over her drawings at midnight and woke up at 5 with new ideas already forming before she was fully conscious. She had never worked this way before, not because she lacked the capacity, but because nothing had ever asked this much of her. Every job she had done before this one had asked for her reliability and her patience and her physical endurance. This asked for something deeper and older, the part of her that had always seen the world in terms of how space could be arranged to serve the people inside it. The part that had stood in the narrow kitchen of her mother's apartment in Inglewood at age 12 and quietly understood that the problem was not the size of the room but the thoughtlessness of whoever had designed it. She thought about that kitchen often while she worked. She thought about the single window that faced a brick wall and gave almost no light. She thought about the counter that stopped 18 inches short of where it needed to be genuinely useful. She thought about the way her mother had adapted around every limitation without complaint, because that was what people did when they had no other choice. And she decided that the entire point of what she was designing now was to give people a choice they had never been offered before. By the end of the first week, she had a rough concept. By the end of the second, she had something she was willing to put her name on. She called Thomas on a Friday evening and told him she was ready. He scheduled the presentation for Monday morning and told her the full project team would be present, which meant Richard Owens would be in the room. She thanked him and hung up and then sat quietly, for a moment, acknowledging the fear before she set it aside and went back to work. The Monday presentation was held in the large, ground-floor boardroom of the Harrington Capital Group building, a room with a long glass table and seating for 20 and a wall of screens at one end. Isabella arrived 30 minutes early and set up her materials alone. She had printed large format drawings, prepared a digital presentation, and built a small physical model out of materials she had bought at a craft supply store, cutting and assembling it herself over the weekend with the focused care of someone who understood that the difference between a good idea and a convincing one was often just the quality of its presentation. The room filled at 10. Thomas sat at the head of the table. Richard sat to his left with two other senior partners. There were engineers, a financial analyst, and two people from the city planning liaison office. Everyone in the room was older than Isabella. Most of them had advanced degrees on their walls and decades of project experience behind them. She was aware of all of this in the way that you are aware of cold water before you step into it, fully and without pretending it's not there. She stood at the front of the room and she began. She did not open with statistics or budget projections. She opened with a story about a kitchen window that faced a brick wall. She told it simply and without performance. Just the facts of it and what they had meant to a 12-year-old girl who had decided somewhere, in that narrow apartment, that space was not just architecture, but dignity. That the way a room was designed told the person living in it something about whether they had been considered or simply accommodated. The room was very quiet. Then she walked them through the work. Her concept divided the 15-acre site into 4 interconnected neighborhoods, each with its own communal garden, shared workspace, and central gathering point, all of them linked by pedestrian paths wide enough for families to walk side by side. Every residential unit faced either green space or a shared courtyard rather than a parking structure. The kitchens were designed with natural light as a non-negotiable feature, not an upgrade. The children's play areas were visible from the kitchen windows of the surrounding units so that parents could watch without leaving the house. The commercial strip along the southern boundary was designed to support small local businesses rather than chain tenants. With rent structures she had researched from 3 comparable developments in other cities, she had thought about everything. The placement of bus stops relative to the entrances, the acoustic separation between units, the communal laundry facilities positioned centrally so that they became social spaces rather than isolated utilities. The way the street lighting was angled to feel safe without feeling institutional. Every single decision had a reason behind it that came from the real experience of real people, and she explained each one clearly and without apology. When she finished, the room was silent for a moment that felt much longer than it. As Richard Owens spoke first. "The financial model needs significant work," he said. "The per-unit cost on this concept is higher than what we projected." "By 14%, Isabella said. "I included an adjusted financing structure on page 9 of the handout that closes the gap using a combination of the city density bonus and a green building tax credit that this design qualifies for. The net cost differential is approximately 4% above the original projection." Richard looked at page 9. He did not say anything. One of the senior partners asked about construction timeline. The city planning liaison asked about zoning compatibility. The financial analyst asked about the commercial lease model. Isabella answered every question. She did not have every answer memorized perfectly and twice. She said clearly that she would need to confirm a specific number before committing to it, which was more reassuring to the room than false certainty would have been. Thomas had not spoken during any of it. He had sat at the head of the table with his hands folded in front of him and watched her, the way she had first watched him walk into the diner, with a quiet and undivided, tension that felt like the most serious kind of respect. After the meeting ended and the room gradually emptied, Richard stopped beside Isabella as he gathered his papers. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, without warmth, but without hostility either, that the kitchen window detail had been the right way to open. She nodded and thanked him, and he left without another word, which, from what she had observed of Richard Owens, was the closest thing to a compliment he was capable of. Offering, Thomas waited until they were alone. He walked around the table to where she was carefully rolling up her drawings, and he stood close enough that she could have reached out and touched his arm without stretching. She kept her hands on the drawings and looked up at him. You knew what you were doing when you asked for 2 weeks, he said. I knew what I needed, she said. That is not always the same thing. He was quiet for a moment. Isabella, I owe you an honest conversation. She set the drawings down. Then have it. When I walked into that diner, I was not looking for a design consultant. I was having a bad morning after a board meeting that had gone poorly, and I was sitting in a neighborhood diner specifically because I did not want to be recognized or talked to. He paused. And then I watched you work. And I remembered something I had spent 5 years trying not to think about. What was that? That the reason I started this company, he said, was not to build expensive towers for people who already had everything. It was because I grew up in a 2-bedroom apartment in Roseland with my mother and my younger brother and a landlord who fixed nothing in a building that told us every single day in 100 small ways that we were not worth thinking about carefully. He looked at her steadily. I lost track of that, somewhere between the first million and the 5th. And you walked into that boardroom today and gave it back to me. Isabella felt the truth of it settle into the room around them both. I have one question for you, she said. The same one I asked in the conference room 2 weeks ago, but applied differently now. Ask it. It's a project going forward. Do you want me to do it my way or yours? Thomas looked at her for a long moment, and in his expression, she saw everything she needed to see. The seriousness of it, the recognition, and underneath both of those things, something quieter and more personal that neither of them had named yet, but that had been present since a coffee pot tipped sideways. On a rainy Tuesday morning, yours, he said without hesitation. I want to see yours. Isabella picked up her drawings and held them against her chest and allowed herself, quietly and without making a show of it, to believe that this was real, not the project, though the project was real. Not the opportunity, though the opportunity was larger than anything she had imagined standing at. That kitchen window at age 12, what was real was simpler and more important than any of those things. It was the feeling of being seen completely. The work and the history and the mind behind it all. By someone who understood the value of exactly what she was. She walked out of that boardroom with Thomas beside her, and the city spread wide and bright through the glass walls around them. And for the first time in a very long time, Isabella Monroe did not feel like someone waiting for her real life to begin. She understood, with a certainty that settled deep and stayed there, that it already had. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this story. If you enjoyed this content, don't forget to click like, share this story with your friends and family, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on more meaningful stories.